The gunshot that killed Matthew Rourke's wife came not from an outlaw's pistol, but from the silent chamber of scarlet fever, and when she drew her last ragged breath on a blistering August afternoon in 1878, he felt something inside him die alongside her. Carson City, Nevada had seen its share of death in the silver boom years, but nothing prepared Matthew for the hollow silence that filled his small ranch house after they lowered Catherine into the hard desert earth. He was 32 years old, his hands calloused from years of breaking horses and mending fences, and he had no idea how a man was supposed to keep breathing when his reason for living had been stolen away by something he could not fight, could not shoot, could not wrestle to the ground. The neighbors came with casseroles and condolences, their faces etched with that particular mixture of pity and relief that came from knowing it was not their own spouse being mourned. Matthew accepted their offerings with mechanical nods, storing the food in his kitchen where it would eventually spoil because he could not bring himself to eat. His ranch hand, a weathered Mexican man named Diego, who had worked the land for 3 years, took over the daily operations without being asked. The horses still needed feeding, the cattle still needed tending, and life on the frontier did not pause for grief no matter how deep it cut. The widow next door arrived on the 5th day after the funeral. Matthew was sitting on his porch in the late afternoon heat, staring at nothing in particular, when he heard the creak of wagon wheels on the dusty road that separated their properties. Vivian Lawson had moved into the neighboring homestead 6 months earlier, a woman of 28 with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight and eyes the color of sage after rain. Her husband had been a prospector who had the poor fortune to be in the wrong mine shaft when the supports gave way, leaving her with 40 acres, a sturdy house, and a loneliness that she wore like a second skin. She climbed down from her wagon with a basket balanced on one hip, and Matthew watched her approach with the same detached interest he might give to a passing cloud. Vivian had been kind to Catherine during her illness, bringing over soups and sitting with her when Matthew had to see to the animals. He appreciated it in the abstract way he appreciated most things now, as if his emotions were happening to someone else entirely. "Matthew," she said, her voice soft but not saccharine. He appreciated that she did not flood him with sympathy or try to tell him that time would heal all wounds. "I brought bread, real bread, not those condolence bricks people have been leaving you." Despite himself, despite the weight pressing on his chest that made every breath feel like lifting a boulder, the corner of his mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was something adjacent to human response. "Condolence bricks," he repeated, and his voice sounded rusty from disuse. "I know what people bring to the bereaved," Vivian said, setting the basket down on the porch railing. "Heavy casseroles that sit in your stomach like guilt. Dense breads that could be used for building materials. When Thomas died, I ate nothing but other people's pity for 2 weeks and felt worse for it." She sat down on the porch step without invitation, arranging her skirts around her with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned to manage life on her own. Matthew found himself studying her profile, the straight line of her nose, the determined set of her jaw. Catherine had been delicate, almost fragile, with pale skin that burned in the Nevada sun. Vivian looked like she had been forged from the desert itself, sun-bronzed and resilient. "I am not much for company right now," Matthew said, but there was no heat in the words. "Good, because I am not much for giving it," Vivian replied. "I just thought you might want to sit with someone who understands that sometimes the worst part is not the crying. It is the not crying, the feeling like you have been scooped hollow and there is nothing left inside worth saving." Matthew looked at her sharply. Everyone else had told him to let it out, to grieve, to find comfort in memories. No one had articulated the numb emptiness that had taken up residence in his chest. "How long does it last?" he asked, and hated how his voice cracked on the question. "I will let you know when it ends," Vivian said. She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. "I am not here to make you feel better, Matthew. I am just here so you know you are not alone in feeling terrible." She left the basket and climbed back into her wagon, and Matthew watched her drive away as the sun began its descent toward the Sierra Nevada mountains in the distance. That night, he ate 3 slices of her bread with butter, and it was the first food that had any taste since Catherine died. Vivian did not return the next day, or the day after that, and Matthew found himself listening for the sound of her wagon, despite his best efforts to remain isolated in his grief. On the 8th day, he saw smoke rising from her property and realized with a start that he had not checked on her well-being since the funeral. Guilt, that old familiar companion, settled over his shoulders as he saddled his horse and rode the short distance to her land. He found her behind her house, trying to wrestle a stubborn fence post into the ground with a mallet that was clearly too heavy for her grip. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, and she was cursing with a creativity that would have made a mule skinner proud. "Need a hand?" Matthew asked, and Vivian jumped, dropping the mallet on her foot. She hopped backward, unleashing another string of profanity that included references to various saints and their questionable parentage. "Sweet mercy, Matthew. You trying to send me to join Thomas?" she demanded, clutching her foot. "Seemed like you were already working toward that end on your own," he said, dismounting. He picked up the mallet and examined the fence post. "This wood is green. It is going to warp in a month." "It is what I could afford," Vivian said, her pride evident in the defensive tilt of her chin. Matthew did not argue. He knew about scraping by, about making do with less than ideal materials, because the silver mines paid well only if you were the one owning them, not working them. He positioned the post and drove it into the earth with 4 solid strikes, his muscles remembering the rhythm even if his heart was not fully in the task. "You have about 6 more of these?" he asked, surveying the fence line. "I can manage them myself," Vivian said. "I know you can. I am asking if you will let me help anyway." Something shifted in her expression, a softening around her eyes. "Yes. 6 more." They worked in companionable silence as the morning heated into a scorching afternoon. Matthew found a strange comfort in the physical labor, in the simple problem of post and earth and mallet. It was concrete, measurable, solvable. When they finished, Vivian brought out a jug of water that had been cooling in her spring house, and they sat in the shade of her barn drinking from tin cups. "Thank you," she said. "I have been putting that off for 3 weeks." "Why did your husband not build a proper fence before he died?" Matthew asked, then immediately regretted the bluntness of the question. But Vivian laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. "Thomas was a dreamer, not a builder. He was convinced he would strike it rich in the mines, and then we would hire people to do things like build fences. He was always 6 months away from the big score, right up until the mountain took him." "Catherine wanted to plant roses," Matthew heard himself say. "English roses, like her grandmother grew in Virginia. I told her they would not survive the desert heat, that she should pick something hardy. She died before we could settle the argument." "Would they have survived?" Vivian asked. "No, but I wish I had let her try." They sat with that truth between them, the weight of things left undone and words left unsaid. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out to the coming evening. "I laugh sometimes," Vivian said suddenly. "At inappropriate moments. I will be mucking out the chicken coop or mending a shirt, and I will remember something ridiculous Thomas said, and I will laugh. Then I feel guilty, like I am betraying his memory by finding joy." Matthew understood exactly what she meant. Just that morning, he had smiled at one of Diego's terrible jokes, then spent the next hour castigating himself for the brief moment of levity. "Catherine had this way of snorting when she laughed too hard," he said. "She hated it, thought it was unladylike. I loved it because it meant she had forgotten to be proper." "When is the last time you laughed?" Vivian asked. Matthew had to think about it. "The day before she took sick. She was trying to teach me to dance, and I stepped on her foot so many times she threatened to make me practice with the barn cat." "And you have not laughed since?" "No." "Then we are both walking around like ghosts, going through motions but not really living." Matthew wanted to argue, but the truth of her words settled into his bones. He was haunting his own life, drifting through days without purpose or pleasure. Catherine would have hated seeing him like this. She had been full of life, always finding wonder in small things, always pushing him to see beyond the immediate struggle of frontier existence. "I do not know how to stop being sad," he admitted. "Neither do I," Vivian said, "but maybe we could figure it out together. Not romance," she added quickly, seeing something in his expression. "Just 2 people who understand that the world kept turning even though we wanted it to stop." It seemed like a reasonable proposition, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man who had forgotten he wanted to be saved. Matthew extended his hand, and Vivian shook it with a firm grip that spoke of competence and determination. "Deal," he said. Over the following weeks, they fell into an easy pattern. Matthew would ride over in the mornings to help with the heavier chores on Vivian's property, And in the evenings, she would bring him meals that actually required eating with utensils. She was a better cook than Catherine had been, though Matthew felt disloyal thinking it. Catherine had approached cooking as a necessary evil, throwing ingredients together with more hope than skill. Vivian cooked with the precision of a woman who had learned to make every ingredient count. "My mother ran a boarding house in San Francisco," she explained one evening, as she showed him how to properly season a roast. She could feed 30 miners on the budget meant for 10, and they would leave convinced they had eaten like kings. "She taught me that cooking is just chemistry with more delicious results." "My mother taught me to shoot straight and keep my mouth shut," Matthew said. "She was not much for domestic arts." "Was she a frontierswoman?" "She was a frontierswoman who got tired of waiting for my father to defend her honor, so she learned to defend it herself. Shot a man in the foot once for making improper suggestions." Vivian laughed, that full-throated sound that Matthew was beginning to recognize and, surprisingly, anticipate. "I like your mother already. She passed when I was 17, cholera outbreak. She fought off raiders and rattlesnakes in a harsh winter that killed half the cattle, but a bad batch of water took her down in 3 days." "The frontier has a way of being cruel like that," Vivian said softly. "The big dangers you can prepare for. It is the invisible ones that get you." They ate dinner on Matthew's porch, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of orange and purple. The conversation flowed easily between them now, no longer weighted with the careful politeness of near strangers. Vivian told him about growing up in San Francisco during the gold rush years, about helping her mother manage the chaos of a boarding house full of men with more money than sense. Matthew shared stories about breaking horses, about the satisfaction of taking a wild, untamed animal and teaching it to trust, to partner rather than fight. "You must have been good at it to make a living," Vivian observed. "Good enough? Catherine hated when I brought home the truly wild ones. She said her heart could not take watching me get thrown." "Did you get thrown often?" "More than I admitted to her." Vivian smiled. "Thomas used to tell me the mines were perfectly safe, that I was worrying over nothing. Then he would come home with new bruises and cuts that he thought I would not notice. Men are fools when it comes to protecting the women they love from worry. And women are fools for pretending to believe them." It was the most normal conversation Matthew had experienced in months, and when Vivian finally left for the evening, he realized he felt lighter. Not happy, not yet, but less like he was drowning in quicksand with every breath. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the promise of autumn. The cottonwoods along the Carson River began to turn gold, and the evening air carried a crispness that made the summer heat seem like a distant memory. Matthew found himself spending more time at Vivian's property, fixing things that Thomas had left incomplete. He repaired her barn roof, replaced the rotting boards on her front porch, and helped her harvest the vegetables from her kitchen garden. In return, Vivian taught him things Catherine had never bothered with. She showed him how to mend his own shirts instead of paying the seamstress in town. She helped him organize his chaotic kitchen into something functional. She even convinced him to wash his windows, pointing out that he might feel less gloomy if he could actually see outside clearly. "You are a tyrant," Matthew grumbled as he scrubbed at a particularly stubborn spot of grime. "I am efficient," Vivian corrected. "There is a difference. Catherine let me live in peaceful squalor. Catherine was a saint. I am merely practical." The words hung between them for a moment, an acknowledgement of the woman who had brought them together even in her absence. Matthew waited for the familiar stab of guilt, but it did not come. Instead, he felt something like gratitude that Catherine had been in his life at all, even if the time had been cut short. "Tell me something about Thomas that annoyed you," Matthew said suddenly. Vivian paused in her own window cleaning. "What?" "Everyone talks about the dead like they were perfect. I want to know something real, something that made you want to throttle him." A slow smile spread across Vivian's face. He could not whistle, but he tried constantly. It was just air and spit, no actual tune, but he was convinced he was making music. Drove me absolutely mad. Matthew laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. Catherine talked in her sleep, full conversations. She would argue with people, negotiate prices at imaginary markets, give elaborate directions to places that did not exist. I never told her because she would have been mortified. "Did you ever argue back?" "Once. She got furious with me in her sleep for buying an orange horse. We did not own any horses that were orange. I have no idea where she got the idea." Vivian dissolved into laughter, clutching the windowsill for support. Her joy was infectious, and Matthew found himself laughing along with her, really laughing for the first time since Catherine's death. It felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once, like he was betraying something sacred, but also honoring it in a way he had not expected. When their laughter finally subsided, Vivian wiped her eyes and looked at him with an expression he could not quite decipher. "That felt good," she said simply. "It did," Matthew agreed. They finished the windows in the comfortable silence, and when Matthew rode home that evening, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It took him until he was unsaddling his horse to recognize it as hope. October brought the first hints of winter, and with it, preparations for the harsh months ahead. Matthew spent his days cutting firewood and making sure his livestock would survive the coming cold. He found himself planning for Vivian's needs as well, checking her wood supply and offering to bring over extra hay for her animals. "You do not have to take care of me," Vivian said one afternoon as he stacked wood beside her house. "I know that. I want to." She studied him for a long moment, and Matthew felt suddenly exposed under her gaze. Something had shifted between them in recent weeks, a subtle change in the way they moved around each other, the way their hands would brush accidentally and then linger just a moment too long. "Why?" she asked quietly. Matthew set down the piece of wood he was holding and met her eyes. "Because when I am helping you, I feel useful. I feel like myself again, not just the ghost of who I used to be." "You were never a ghost," Vivian said. "Just a man learning to survive grief. You helped with that. We helped each other." She was right, of course. Vivian had her own ghosts, her own weight of loss that she carried with grace and humor. They had stumbled into each other's orbits at exactly the right moment, two broken people who understood that healing was not a straight line, but a meandering path with setbacks and small victories. That evening, Vivian invited Matthew to stay for supper, and as they ate, she told him about her plans for the spring. She wanted to expand her chicken coop, maybe get a few pigs. She was considering planting an orchard, though she knew it would be years before the trees produced fruit. "You are thinking long-term," Matthew observed. "I am thinking about building a life, not just surviving day to day," Vivian said. "Thomas and I, we were always in waiting mode, waiting for the big strike, waiting for our real life to begin. I am done waiting." Her words resonated with Matthew. He had been in a different kind of waiting, holding his breath for the grief to pass, for some magical moment when he would feel normal again. But perhaps normal was not the goal. Perhaps the goal was simply to keep moving forward, to find new reasons to get out of bed each morning. "What would you plant?" he asked. "In your orchard?" Vivian's face lit up. "Apples, definitely. Maybe some pears. Peaches if I can find a variety that would tolerate the climate. I know it is foolish, planting something I will not see pay off for years." "It is not foolish. It is hopeful. Is there a difference?" "I am starting to think there might not be." They talked late into the evening, long after the supper dishes had been cleared. Matthew found himself telling Vivian about his dreams, things he had not even shared with Catherine because they had seemed too impractical. He wanted to breed horses specifically suited for the harsh Nevada climate, animals that could thrive in the desert rather than merely surviving it. He wanted to write a book about horse training techniques, codifying what he had learned through years of trial and error. "Why have you not done it?" Vivian asked. "Life gets in the way, work, responsibilities, and then Catherine got sick and nothing else mattered." "Life will always get in the way if you let it," Vivian said. "My mother used to tell me that you have to steal time for your dreams, hide it away like a miser with gold, because no one will give you permission to chase what matters to you." "Your mother was a wise woman." "She was. I wish she could have met Thomas. She died a year before I married him. Sometimes I think she would have warned me that he was more dream than substance, but I was too in love to listen." "Did you love him?" Matthew asked, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. "I am sorry, that is not my business." "I did love him," Vivian said slowly, "but I am not sure he was the great love of my life. He was exciting and charming, and made me feel like I was part of an adventure, but there was not depth there." "Not really? Does that make me terrible?" "It makes you honest." "What about you and Catherine?" Matthew considered the question carefully. "I loved her deeply. She was good and kind and deserved better than dying young in the desert. But our marriage was quiet, comfortable. We did not challenge each other much." "Do you think that is what marriage should be? Comfortable? I do not know anymore. I used to think so. Now, I wonder if comfortable is just another word for settling. Vivian leaned back in her chair, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. Maybe the trick is finding someone who makes you comfortable and challenges you. Someone who feels like home, but also like adventure. The words hung between them, charged with possibility. Matthew felt his heart rate pick up, a nervousness he had not experienced since he was a young man courting Catherine. But this was different. This was not the innocent hope of youth, but the complicated awareness of two people who had loved and lost and knew exactly what they were risking. I should head home, Matthew said, standing abruptly. It is getting late. If Vivian was disappointed by his sudden departure, she did not show it. She walked him to the door, and when he mounted his horse, she raised a hand in farewell. Same time tomorrow? She asked. Same time tomorrow, he confirmed. As Matthew rode home under a sky brilliant with stars, he tried to untangle the knot of emotions in his chest. Guilt was there, yes, the feeling that moving forward meant leaving Catherine behind. But there was also excitement, the thrill of connection with someone who understood him in ways Catherine never had. Vivian challenged him, pushed him to think beyond his immediate circumstances, made him want to be better. The question was whether he was brave enough to act on those feelings, or whether he would let fear and loyalty to the past keep him frozen in place. November arrived with cold winds that whistled down from the mountains, and Carson City began preparing for winter in earnest. Matthew spent a full day riding into town for supplies, stocking up on flour and coffee and other staples that would see him through the isolated months ahead. He found himself buying extra, things that Vivian might need, and when he loaded his wagon, he made sure to pack a bolt of fabric he had seen her admiring in the general store. The proprietor, a shrewd man named Hoskins, raised an eyebrow at Matthew's purchases. Stocking up for 2 households, Rourke? Just being neighborly, Matthew said evenly. Neighborly, Hoskins repeated with a knowing smirk. That what they are calling it these days? Matthew felt heat rise in his face, but refused to take the bait. Small-town gossip was inevitable, and he would not fuel it by reacting. He paid for his goods and headed home, stopping at Vivian's property on the way. She was in her barn, tending to a horse that was favoring its left foreleg. Matthew set down his packages and approached, his practiced eye immediately assessing the problem. Looks like an abscess, he said, crouching beside the animal. That is what I thought. I was planning to ride into town and fetch the farrier. No need, I can handle it. Matthew worked with steady confidence, cleaning the affected hoof and applying a poultice he mixed from supplies in Vivian's tack room. The horse, a gentle mare named Daisy, stood patiently through the procedure, only occasionally tossing her head. You are good with animals, Vivian observed. Animals are straightforward. They do not hide what they are feeling or pretend to be something they are not. Is that a commentary on people? Maybe. Vivian laughed softly. Fair enough, though I would argue that you are fairly straightforward yourself. You have never struck me as someone who plays games. Life is too short for games, Matthew said, finishing his work and straightening up. I brought you some things from town, supplies for winter. He showed her what he had purchased, and when she saw the fabric, her expression softened. Matthew, this is too much. I cannot accept this. It is a gift. You are allowed to accept gifts. People will talk. Let them talk. Vivian clutched the fabric to her chest, and Matthew saw her eyes grow bright with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered. They stood in the barn, the moment stretching between them like a held breath. Matthew felt the urge to reach for her, to close the distance and pull her into his arms, but uncertainty held him back. What if he was misreading the situation? What if she saw him only as a friend, a fellow survivor of grief, and nothing more? As if sensing his internal struggle, Vivian stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. The touch was light but deliberate, and when Matthew met her eyes, he saw his own confusion and longing reflected back at him. I feel like I am betraying Thomas, Vivian said quietly, even though I know he would want me to be happy, even though I know he has been gone long enough that moving forward is not disloyal. I still feel guilty. I feel the same way about Catherine, Matthew admitted. Like if I let myself care for someone else, I am erasing what we had. But you know that is not true. I know that is not true. Knowing and feeling are different things. Vivian nodded, her hand still resting on his arm. So, what do we do? I do not know. They stood there in the dimming light of the barn, two people caught between past and future, between grief and hope. Finally, Vivian withdrew her hand and took a step back. Maybe we just keep doing what we have been doing, she said. Taking it one day at a time, no rushing, no pressure, just being honest with ourselves and each other. It seemed like a reasonable approach, a way to navigate the complicated terrain of their feelings without forcing anything. Matthew nodded his agreement, and they walked back to the house together, their shoulders occasionally brushing in a way that felt both accidental and inevitable. That night, as Matthew lay in his empty bed, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to not be alone, to wake up beside someone who understood him, who challenged him, who made him laugh. The image that came to mind was not Catherine's face, but Vivian's, and instead of guilt, Matthew felt a tentative peace settle over him. Perhaps moving forward did not mean forgetting. Perhaps it meant honoring the past by refusing to let it become a prison. Winter set in with a vengeance in mid-November, bringing snow that blanketed the valley and turned the landscape into a crystalline wonderland. Matthew found himself checking on Vivian more frequently, concerned about her managing alone in the harsh weather. She tolerated his hovering with good humor, occasionally pointing out that she had survived one winter already without his help. "But you will note I am not refusing your help this time," she added with a smile. "I may be independent, but I'm not stupid." They fell into a routine of shared meals and evening conversations by the fire. Sometimes they talked about their lost spouses, sharing memories without the heavy weight of fresh grief. Other times they talked about everything else, their hopes and fears and the small details of daily life. Matthew learned that Vivian had a weakness for peppermint candy and detective novels. She discovered that he could play the harmonica, but only sad songs, because those were the only ones his father had taught him. "Play something happy," Vivian demanded one evening. "I do not know any happy songs." "Then make one up." Matthew looked at her skeptically. "You want me to improvise a happy harmonica song? Is that so unreasonable?" Completely unreasonable. But he tried anyway, producing a series of notes that could generously be described as enthusiastic rather than melodic. Vivian laughed so hard she nearly fell out of her chair, and Matthew found himself grinning, despite the truly terrible sounds coming from his instrument. "That was awful," Vivian gasped between laughs. "You are the one who requested it." "I take it back. Stick to sad songs. At least those sound intentional." Matthew set aside the harmonica and watched Vivian as she wiped tears of laughter from her eyes. She was beautiful when she laughed, her whole face lighting up with joy. He wanted to make her laugh like that every day, to chase away the shadows that sometimes crossed her expression when she thought no one was looking. "What are you thinking about?" Vivian asked, catching him staring. "That I am glad you moved here," Matthew said honestly. "That I am glad I got to know you." Vivian's expression softened. "I am glad too. I do not know what I would have done this past year without you. You made everything more bearable. We made it bearable for each other." "Yes," Vivian agreed quietly. "We did." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled around the house, but inside was warm and safe. Matthew felt a contentment he had not experienced in longer than he could remember, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with forgetting the past and everything to do with embracing the present. "Matthew," Vivian said hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" "Anything?" "Do you ever think about the future, about what comes next?" Matthew considered the question carefully. "I do, more than I used to. For a long time after Catherine died, I could not see past the next day. But lately I have been thinking further ahead, planning things." "What kind of things?" "Breeding program for the horses, maybe hiring another hand to help Diego, expanding the ranch." He paused, then added quietly, "Not being alone." Vivian's breath caught audibly. "Not being alone," she repeated. "I am not good at this," Matthew said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, "at talking about feelings or making pretty speeches. But I need you to know that what I feel for you is not just gratitude or loneliness. You have become important to me, Vivian, more important than I knew how to acknowledge." "I feel the same way," Vivian whispered. "I have for weeks now, but I did not know how to say it without feeling like I was dishonoring Thomas or rushing things or making a fool of myself." "You could never make a fool of yourself. You have clearly not seen me trying to wrestle a stubborn cow. Matthew laughed, the tension breaking between them. Vivian stood and crossed to where he sat, and when she reached out her hand, he took it without hesitation. Her fingers were warm in his, calloused from work, but gentle. I do not know what this is, Vivian said, or what it will become, but I would like to find out, if you are willing. I am willing, Matthew said, pulling her down to sit beside him. More than willing. They sat together on the sofa, hands intertwined, watching the fire burn down to embers. It was not a declaration of undying love or a passionate embrace, but it felt monumental nonetheless. Two people choosing to move forward together, to build something new from the ashes of their losses. When Matthew finally rode home that night, the cold air stinging his face, he felt lighter than he had in a year. The guilt was still there, a quiet presence in the back of his mind, but it no longer defined him. Catherine would have wanted him to be happy. He knew that with a certainty that came from truly knowing someone, from years of partnership and love, and he was happy. Not in the carefree way of someone who had never known loss, but in the deeper, more resilient way of someone who had survived the worst and chose joy anyway. December arrived with bitter cold and the promise of Christmas. Matthew found himself thinking about the holiday for the first time since Catherine's death. Last year he had ignored it completely, letting the day pass like any other. But this year felt different. This year he wanted to mark the occasion, to celebrate life and connection and the small miracles of everyday existence. He rode into Carson City during a break in the weather and purchased gifts. For Diego, a new pair of work gloves and a bottle of decent whiskey. For Vivian, he agonized over the choices, wanting something meaningful without being presumptuous. He finally settled on a set of hair combs made from polished silver and a leather-bound journal with blank pages. For writing down her orchard plans, he told the shopkeeper, who nodded with approval. That Vivian Lawson is a good woman, the shopkeeper said. Smart and capable. You could do worse, Rourke. Matthew did not bother denying the implication. The whole town knew by now that he and Vivian were spending time together, and while there had been some raised eyebrows initially, most people seemed to approve. They were both young enough to remarry, both alone in a place where solitude could be dangerous. It made practical sense, even if what Matthew felt was far more than practical. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow and a sky so clear the stars looked close enough to touch. Matthew had invited Vivian and Diego to his house for dinner, a simple meal that they had prepared together over the course of the afternoon. Diego brought his guitar and his surprisingly good singing voice. Vivian contributed her famous apple pie, made from dried apples she had preserved in the fall. They ate and talked and sang songs that ranged from hymns to bawdy frontier ballads that made Vivian blush and laugh in equal measure. It was the kind of evening that Matthew had thought was behind him, full of warmth and companionship and joy. When Diego finally excused himself to head back to his small cabin on the edge of Matthew's property, Vivian and Matthew were left alone by the fire. I have something for you, Matthew said, retrieving the wrapped packages from where he had hidden them. Vivian's eyes went wide. Matthew, you did not have to do that. I wanted to. She opened the gifts with careful fingers, gasping when she saw the hair combs. These are beautiful, she breathed, running her thumb over the intricate scrollwork. They reminded me of you, elegant but practical. I love them. She opened the journal next, and her expression softened even further. How did you know? You are always making lists and plans on scraps of paper. I thought you could use something proper to keep track of all those ideas. Vivian set the gifts aside and reached into her own bag, pulling out a package wrapped in brown paper and twine. Now, I feel like my gift is inadequate. Matthew opened it to find a thick wool scarf in shades of blue and gray, clearly hand-knitted with careful attention to detail. You made this? I have been working on it for weeks. My fingers are still cramped from all the stitching. Matthew wrapped the scarf around his neck, feeling the immediate warmth and the care that had gone into every stitch. It is perfect, thank you. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the fire crackling and the gifts resting on their laps like promises. Then Vivian spoke, her voice soft but steady. I have been thinking about what you said, about not being alone. Matthew's heart began to pound. And I think I would like that too, with you, if you are serious. I am serious. We should be practical about it, Vivian continued, her words coming faster now, as if she had been rehearsing them. "We could court properly, let enough time pass to be respectable. Or we could acknowledge that we are both adults who have been married before and know our own minds. We could do this our way, on our timeline." What timeline would that be? Vivian met his eyes, and Matthew saw determination there, mixed with vulnerability. "I know what I want, Matthew. I want to build a life with someone who makes me laugh and challenges me and sees me as a partner. I want to wake up next to someone I trust. I want to stop being alone." "So do I," Matthew said. "With you, only with you." The space between them seemed to evaporate. Matthew reached for Vivian at the same moment she leaned toward him, and when their lips met, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The kiss was tender and searching, full of question and answer all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "That was nice," Vivian said, and then laughed at the inadequacy of the word. "Better than nice," Matthew agreed. "What do we do now?" Matthew considered the question. What did two people do when they decided to build a future together? The traditional path would be a long courtship, then an engagement, then a wedding planned months in advance. But they were not traditional people in a traditional situation. "We could get married," Matthew said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "Soon, in the new year, if you want to." "That is fast? Too fast?" Vivian shook her head slowly. "No, not too fast. We have both been married before. We know what we are getting into, and I would rather spend the rest of my life with you than waste time being proper for the sake of appearances." "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes." They sealed the agreement with another kiss, and this one was less tentative, more certain. Matthew felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. Joy and relief and anticipation all tangled together, chasing away the last lingering shadows of grief. This was not forgetting Catherine. This was honoring her by continuing to live, to love, to embrace the messy, beautiful complexity of human connection. When they finally separated, both were grinning like fools. "We are really doing this," Vivian said. "We are really doing this. People will talk. Let them." Vivian laughed, that full-bodied, joyous sound that Matthew had come to crave. "My practical cowboy. What will the gossips do without us to scandalize them? They will find someone else to fixate on." They stayed up late into the night, making plans and dreaming about the future. They would combine their properties, creating a larger and more prosperous ranch. Vivian would finally plant her orchard, and Matthew would begin his horse breeding program in earnest. They would hire additional help, maybe build a new barn, definitely add rooms to whichever house they decided to make their primary residence. "Your house is bigger," Vivian noted, "but mine has the better water access. We could split our time, or build something new that is ours together. I like that idea, a fresh start." When Vivian finally left for home in the early hours of Christmas morning, Matthew walked her out to her wagon under a sky full of stars. The cold was fierce, but neither of them seemed to notice. "Merry Christmas," Vivian said, and Matthew heard the joy in her voice. "Merry Christmas," he echoed, "and here is to many more together." They married on a cold January morning in 1879, standing before a judge in Carson City with Diego and Vivian's closest neighbor, a woman named Margaret, serving as witnesses. There was no elaborate ceremony, no white dress or formal reception. Vivian wore her best calico dress and the silver hair combs Matthew had given her for Christmas. Matthew wore his cleanest shirt and the scarf Vivian had knitted, even though they were indoors. The judge, a pragmatic man who had seen his share of frontier weddings, kept the ceremony brief. "Do you, Matthew Rourke, take Vivian Lawson to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "Do you, Vivian Lawson, take Matthew Rourke to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Nevada, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Matthew did, with an enthusiasm that made Diego whistle, and Margaret fan herself with her handkerchief. When they broke apart, both were grinning, and Matthew felt a completeness he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. They celebrated with a meal at the best restaurant Carson City had to offer, which was saying very little, but the company was good and the mood was festive. Diego told increasingly improbable stories about his youth in Mexico, and Margaret offered marital advice that was equal parts wise and scandalous. "The secret to a happy marriage," she declared, waving her fork for emphasis, is separate blankets and shared desserts. I will keep that in mind, Vivian said, her eyes sparkling with laughter. When they finally returned to Matthew's house, which was now officially their house, Diego tactfully made himself scarce. Matthew carried Vivian over the threshold despite her protests that it was unnecessary, and they stood in the main room of what was now their shared home. "This is strange," Vivian said. "I know you. We have spent almost every day together for months, but this feels different." "It is different," Matthew agreed. "Better." That night, they lay together in Matthew's bed, which would soon be replaced with something bigger that belonged to both of them. Vivian's head rested on Matthew's chest, and he ran his fingers through her hair, marveling at the softness of it. "Are you happy?" Vivian asked quietly. "More than I thought possible 6 months ago," Matthew said honestly. "You gave me back my life, Vivian. You taught me that moving forward was not betrayal, that I could honor the past and still build a future. We gave that to each other," Vivian corrected. "I was just as lost as you were, just as convinced that being alone was what I deserved." "What changed your mind?" "You did. The way you looked at me like I was capable of anything. The way you made me laugh even when I wanted to stay sad. The way you showed up day after day, not trying to fix me, but just being present." Matthew pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you," he said, the words coming easily now. "I do not know when it happened exactly, but somewhere between fence posts and window washing and terrible harmonica playing, I fell completely in love with you." "I love you too," Vivian said, "and I am not afraid of it anymore. I am not afraid of being happy." They made love that night with a tenderness that came from genuine connection, from knowing each other's scars and choosing to love anyway. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Matthew felt peace settle over him, like a blessing. Catherine would always be part of his story, a chapter that had shaped him in fundamental ways. But Vivian was his future, his partner, his second chance at building a life worth living. The winter passed in a blur of shared routines and small discoveries. Matthew and Vivian fell into an easy partnership, dividing labor according to skill rather than traditional gender roles. Vivian proved to be better at managing the ranch finances, her mind quick with numbers and long-term planning. Matthew handled most of the physical labor, though Vivian was never far away when there was heavy lifting to be done. They made decisions together, from the mundane choices about what to have for dinner to larger questions about expanding their operations. It was a different dynamic than Matthew had experienced with Catherine, who had been content to let him make most decisions while she focused on keeping house. Vivian had opinions about everything and was not shy about expressing them. "We should diversify," she said one evening as they reviewed their finances. "We are too dependent on horse sales. What happens if there is a bad year?" "There is never a bad year for horses," Matthew said. "There could be. Disease, economic downturn, competition from ranches with better stock. You have been thinking about this. I am always thinking about this. We need security, Matthew, multiple revenue streams. Maybe we raise some cattle along with the horses. Maybe we start offering horse training services beyond just breaking and selling." Matthew studied his wife with admiration. "When did you become an expert on ranch management?" "When I married a rancher and decided I wanted us to succeed," Vivian said matter-of-factly. "Besides, I watched my mother run a business for years. The principles are the same, whether you are feeding miners or raising livestock." They implemented Vivian's suggestions, and by spring, their operation was more robust and varied. Matthew took on clients who wanted their horses trained for specific purposes, and Vivian managed a small herd of cattle that Diego helped tend. The workload was intense, but the rewards were tangible. For the first time since Catherine's death, Matthew felt like he was building something that would last. Spring brought the time for planting Vivian's long, anticipated orchard. They marked out a space on the southern edge of their combined property, an area with good drainage and protection from the harsh north winds. Matthew had ordered saplings from California, spending more than was strictly wise on varieties that the nurseryman swore would tolerate the Nevada climate. The day the trees arrived, Vivian looked at them with such joy that Matthew knew he would have paid twice the price to see that expression. They spent 3 days digging holes and planting the young trees, Diego helping, despite his skepticism about fruit trees in the desert. "They will die," he predicted cheerfully, "but it will be a noble death." "They will not die," Vivian said firmly. "I will personally water each one every day if that is what it takes." That is 50 trees, Matthew pointed out. Then I will be very busy. True to her word, Vivian tended those trees with devoted attention. Matthew often found her in the orchard at dawn or dusk, checking each sapling for signs of stress or disease, adjusting the irrigation system they had rigged up, talking to them like they were children who needed encouragement. "Do you think I am crazy?" she asked one evening as they walked through the rows together. "I think you are determined," Matthew said. "There is a difference. My mother used to say that stubbornness was a virtue if you applied it to the right things. Then you are extremely virtuous." Vivian laughed and took his hand, and they stood together watching the sun set over their land. This was happiness, Matthew realized. Not the absence of hardship, but the presence of partnership and purpose. The knowledge that whatever challenges came, they would face them together. Summer arrived with its punishing heat, and Vivian's daily tree-watering regime became a test of endurance. Matthew helped when he could, but the ranch work was demanding, especially during the busy season. They hired 2 additional hands, young men from town who were eager for steady work, and the extra help made everything more manageable. In late July, Vivian started feeling ill in the mornings. At first, she attributed it to the heat or something she had eaten. But when the nausea persisted for 2 weeks, Matthew insisted she see the doctor in town. She returned from the appointment with a dazed expression that made Matthew's heart seize with fear. "What did he say?" he demanded. "Are you sick? Do you need medicine?" "I am pregnant," Vivian said, and then laughed at his shocked expression. "We are going to have a baby, Matthew." The news hit Matthew like a physical blow. A baby, a child, new life growing from the love they had built together. He reached for Vivian and pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling emotion clog his throat. "Are you happy?" Vivian asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "I am terrified and thrilled in equal measure," Matthew admitted. "Are you happy?" "Yes. I did not think I would get this chance. Thomas and I tried for 3 years with no success. I thought maybe I could not have children. When is the baby due?" "February, the doctor thinks. Right in the middle of winter, naturally." Matthew laughed, the sound shaky with emotion. A February baby meant months of waiting, of watching Vivian's body change and preparing for a new person to join their lives. It felt like a gift he had not dared to hope for, a tangible symbol of their future together. The news spread through Carson City with the speed of all good gossip. People who had been skeptical about the quick marriage now nodded approvingly. A baby legitimized everything, proved that Matthew and Vivian's union was about building a family, not just easing loneliness. The women of the town rallied around Vivian, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and dire warnings about the trials of childbirth. "You would think I was the first woman to ever have a baby," Vivian complained one evening after a particularly intense visit from a neighbor. Mrs. Henderson spent 45 minutes describing her labor in excruciating detail. I am not sure if she was trying to prepare me or terrify me. "Probably both," Matthew said. He was sitting at the table attempting to carve a rattle from a piece of wood, a project that was proving more difficult than anticipated. "What is that supposed to be?" Vivian asked, eyeing his handiwork. "A rattle, obviously. It looks like a lumpy potato." "It is a work in progress." Vivian came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his shoulders, resting her chin on top of his head. "You are going to be a wonderful father," she said softly. "How do you know?" "Because you are patient and kind and you do not give up on things you care about, even lumpy potato rattles." Matthew set down his carving and turned to pull Vivian onto his lap, mindful of her growing belly. "I am scared," he admitted. "What if something goes wrong? What if I lose you the way I lost Catherine?" "You will not lose me," Vivian said firmly. "I am strong and healthy, and the doctor says everything looks good. But I understand the fear, Matthew. After losing Thomas, every time you ride off to check on the cattle, I worry you will not come back. We cannot live in fear. No, we cannot. We just have to trust that we are strong enough to handle whatever comes, together." It became their mantra through the remaining months of Vivian's pregnancy. Together they prepared the spare bedroom as a nursery, painting the walls a cheerful yellow and building a cradle from oak wood. Together, they managed the ranch through the busy fall season, with Matthew taking on more of the physical work as Vivian's belly grew. Together, they endured the concerned hovering of neighbors and Diego's increasingly nervous pacing as the due date approached. "I have delivered many foals," Diego said one evening, But human babies are different, yes? Somewhat, Matthew said dryly. If you need help, I can boil water. This is what people do in these situations, I think. Boil water and tear sheets. I will keep that in mind. In truth, Matthew was just as nervous as Diego. The closer Vivian got to her due date, the more memories surfaced of Catherine's illness, of feeling helpless in the face of suffering. He knew intellectually that pregnancy was not illness, that women gave birth successfully every day. But fear was not logical, and his nights were increasingly plagued by anxiety dreams. Vivian, for her part, seemed remarkably calm. She moved through the final weeks with the same practical determination she brought to everything, making lists of supplies they would need and ensuring everything was in order. Only occasionally did Matthew catch glimpses of her own nervousness, usually late at night when she thought he was asleep. I hope I am a good mother, she whispered one night, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Matthew pulled her close. You will be an excellent mother. You are strong and smart, and you already love this child so much. What if I do not know what to do? Then we will figure it out together, just like we figure out everything else. February arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow that made travel treacherous. Matthew became increasingly anxious about being snowed in when Vivian went into labor, unable to fetch the doctor or midwife. He kept the roads to town as clear as possible and made sure the horses were always ready for a quick trip if needed. The baby came on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks earlier than expected. Vivian's water broke while she was making bread, and she looked down at the puddle on the kitchen floor with an expression of surprise and annoyance. Well, she said, I suppose that batch is ruined. Matthew sprang into action with barely controlled panic. He sent Diego racing to town for the midwife despite the icy roads, helped Vivian into the bedroom they had prepared, and tried to remember everything the doctor had told them about the birthing process. His mind was blank with fear. Matthew, Vivian said calmly during a contraction, you need to breathe. You are turning purple. I am breathing. You are holding your breath. Breathe with me. He did, and the simple act of focusing on breath helped settle his nerves. They fell into a rhythm of timing contractions and walking the room when Vivian felt restless. By the time the midwife arrived, red-cheeked from the cold and radiating competence, labor was well established. First babies usually take a while, the midwife, a woman named Sarah, announced. Settle in for a long evening, Mr. Rourke. But Vivian's labor progressed quickly, her body knowing what to do even if her mind was uncertain. As the contractions intensified, she gripped Matthew's hand hard enough to leave bruises. But he did not complain. He would bear any pain to see her through this safely. You are doing so well, he murmured during a particularly hard contraction. You are the strongest person I know. I am considering punching you, Vivian gasped. That is fair, the midwife laughed. She is in transition. Not much longer now, Mrs. Rourke. She was right. Within the hour, Vivian was pushing, her face red with effort and determination. Matthew supported her from behind, whispering encouragement, praying to every deity he could think of that both mother and child would survive this ordeal. And then, with a final push and a cry that was equal parts pain and triumph, the baby arrived. A boy, red-faced and furious, with a powerful set of lungs that he demonstrated immediately. You have a son, Sarah announced, placing the baby on Vivian's chest. And he is perfect. Matthew stared at the tiny person, overwhelmed by a surge of love so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. His son, his and Vivian's, a new life created from their love, from their choice to move forward and build a future together. Hello, little one, Vivian whispered, tears streaming down her face. We have been waiting for you. The baby quieted at her voice, his dark eyes trying to focus on this new world he had entered. Matthew reached out with one finger to stroke the impossibly soft cheek, and the baby's tiny hand instinctively grasped his finger with surprising strength. He is strong, Matthew said, his voice rough with emotion. He is a Rourke, Vivian said with a tired smile. Of course he is strong. They named him Marcus Thomas Rourke, honoring both Matthew's father and Vivian's first husband. It felt right to acknowledge the past while celebrating the future, to let their son carry forward the legacy of the people they had loved and lost. The weeks after Marcus's birth passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding. Matthew discovered reserves of patience he did not know he possessed. walking the floor with a crying baby at 2 in the morning while Vivian caught brief stretches of sleep. Diego became an unlikely helper, revealing a surprising aptitude for calming fussy infants with Spanish lullabies. "You are good at this," Vivian observed one afternoon, watching Diego rock Marcus to sleep with practiced ease. "I have many nieces and nephews in Mexico," Diego explained. "Babies are just small people. You hold them gently, speak softly, and do not act afraid. They can sense fear." "Like horses," Matthew said. "Exactly like horses, but with more crying." As spring arrived and Marcus grew from a helpless newborn into a more alert infant, life settled into new patterns. Vivian managed the ranch finances and supervised the hired hands while caring for the baby. Matthew handled the physical work and took over Marcus's care in the evenings so Vivian could rest. They were exhausted but happy, their lives full of purpose and love. One evening in late May, they stood together in Vivian's orchard, which was now bursting with blossoms from the surviving trees. Not all of the saplings had made it through their first year, but enough had thrived to create a small forest of promise. "Look at that," Vivian breathed, Marcus sleeping in her arms. "They are actually going to produce fruit." "I never doubted you," Matthew said. "You absolutely doubted me, but you supported me anyway. That is what love is, supporting each other's crazy ideas." Vivian laughed and leaned into him, and Matthew wrapped his arms around both wife and son. This was his family, his life, the future he had built from the ashes of grief. "Do you ever think about Catherine?" Vivian asked quietly. "Sometimes," Matthew admitted. "Usually when I am doing something I wish I could tell her about. I think she would have liked you. I think Thomas would have liked you too, though he probably would have been jealous of your horse skills." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set through the apple blossoms. Marcus stirred and made a small sound, and Vivian shifted him to a more comfortable position. "I want more," she said suddenly. "More what?" "More children, more years, more everything. I want to grow old with you, Matthew. I want to watch our children grow, and maybe even meet grandchildren. I want to sit on a porch 40 years from now and look back on a full life." "That sounds perfect," Matthew said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Let us do exactly that." The years that followed were full and challenging and joyful, in the way that real life is joyful, with both triumphs and setbacks. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming known throughout the region for quality horses and well-trained stock. Vivian's orchard produced its first small harvest 3 years after planting, and by the 5th year, they were selling apples and pears to merchants in Carson City. Marcus grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses almost as much as his father did. When he was 5, Vivian gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, honoring Matthew's first wife with gratitude rather than sorrow. 2 years later came another son, Henry, who entered the world screaming and never quite stopped making his presence known. The house they had built together, combining elements of both their original homes, rang with the sounds of childhood. There were skinned knees to bandage and sibling squabbles to mediate and countless bedtime stories to tell. Matthew taught Marcus to ride and care for horses, passing on skills that had been passed to him. Vivian taught Catherine to read and keep accounts, preparing her daughter for a world that was slowly changing to give women more opportunities. Diego remained with them, becoming honorary uncle to the children and invaluable partner in managing the expanding ranch. He married late, at 52, to a widow from town who appreciated his gentle nature and terrible jokes. They built a small house on the edge of the property and became part of the extended family that Matthew and Vivian had created. On quiet evenings, when the children were finally in bed and the ranch work was done, Matthew and Vivian would sit together on their porch and watch the sunset paint the Nevada desert in impossible colors. Sometimes they talked about the past, remembering Catherine and Thomas with fondness rather than pain. More often they talked about the present and future, making plans and dreaming dreams. "Do you remember when we met?" Vivian asked one evening, her head resting on Matthew's shoulder. "You were so lost." "We were both lost," Matthew corrected, "just looking for a way back. And we found it together. Best navigation I ever did." Vivian laughed, that same full-throated sound that had first made Matthew feel human again, all those years ago. The sound still filled him with joy, with gratitude for the unexpected gift of second chances. Inside the house, one of the children called out, and they heard Catherine's patient voice responding, helping her younger brother with some crisis or another. The sounds of family, of life, continuing in its beautiful, messy way. "We should go in," Vivian said, but neither of them moved. "In a minute," Matthew said, pulling her closer. "Let me just sit here with you a minute longer." So they sat, two people who had survived loss and found love again, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The past was part of them, woven into the fabric of who they had become, but the future stretched ahead full of possibility, and they would walk into it together, hand in hand, building a life that honored both grief and joy. The Wild West was unforgiving, beautiful, harsh, and full of unexpected grace. It had taken from them, but it had also given. In the end, Matthew and Vivian had found what everyone searches for: someone to weather the storms with, someone to laugh with, someone to build dreams alongside. They had found home in each other, and that was the greatest fortune of all. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing of seasons and the growth of their children. Marcus became a skilled horseman, who eventually took over the breeding program, developing a strain of desert horses that could thrive in the harsh Nevada climate. He married at 23, bringing a bright young woman named Elizabeth into the family. Their wedding was held in Vivian's orchard, now a mature grove that provided shade and beauty in equal measure. Catherine, their daughter, proved to have her mother's head for business and her father's way with animals. She helped expand their operations to include a small hotel in Carson City, providing accommodations for travelers and becoming a respected businesswoman in her own right. She chose not to marry, declaring that she was perfectly content managing her life on her own terms, and both Matthew and Vivian supported her choice without question. Henry, the youngest, was the dreamer of the family. He loved the ranch, but loved reading and learning even more. With his parents' blessing and financial support, he attended university in San Francisco, becoming a teacher and eventually returning to Carson City to educate the next generation. He married a fellow teacher, and together they raised children who valued both practical skills and intellectual pursuits. Matthew and Vivian watched their children build their own lives with pride and occasional worry, as all parents do. They became grandparents multiple times over, their house and land filled with the chaos and joy of family gatherings. Diego and his wife were always included in these celebrations, their presence as natural as breathing. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Matthew surprised Vivian with a trip to San Francisco. It was the first time they had left the ranch for more than a day or two since Marcus was born, and Vivian was both excited and nervous about the adventure. They stayed in a proper hotel with indoor plumbing and electric lights, marveling at how different city life was from their rural existence. Matthew took her to the best restaurants, to the theater, to the waterfront, where ships from around the world docked with exotic goods. But Vivian's favorite part was visiting the boarding house district where she had grown up. Her mother's boarding house was still standing, though under different ownership now. They stood across the street looking at it, and Vivian's eyes grew distant with memory. She would have loved knowing how things turned out, Vivian said quietly. That I built a good life, that I was happy. She knew, Matthew said with certainty. Mothers always know. On their last night in the city, as they prepared for bed in their fancy hotel room, Vivian turned to Matthew with the same direct gaze that had first captured his attention years ago. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For everything. For being patient when I was grieving. For making me laugh when I had forgotten how. For building this life with me. For loving me even when I was difficult." "You are never difficult," Matthew said. "Challenging, maybe. Stubborn, definitely, but never difficult." Vivian threw a pillow at him, and he caught it laughing. Even after 20 years of marriage, she could still surprise him, still make him feel like the luckiest man alive. "I love you," he said, setting the pillow aside and pulling her close. "More now than the day we married, more than I knew was possible." "I love you too," Vivian said, "and I would choose you all over again, every single time." They returned to the ranch rejuvenated, ready to tackle the challenges of another year. The work never stopped, but they had long ago learned to find joy in the daily rhythms of ranch life. There was satisfaction in seeing horses they had raised win races or become beloved mounts for new owners. There was pride in watching their children succeed and their grandchildren grow. There was contentment in sitting together after a long day, hands clasped, watching the sun set over land they had tended together for decades. When Matthew turned 60, Diego organized a surprise party that brought together neighbors from all over the county. There was music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. Matthew stood on his porch looking out at the gathering, overwhelmed by the community they had built. "You look contemplative," Vivian said, joining him with 2 glasses of punch. "Just thinking about how different my life could have been," Matthew said. "If you had not moved in next door, if you had not shown up with that bread and your blunt honesty, if I had stayed locked in grief instead of learning to live again. We saved each other," Vivian said simply. "That is what love does." Marcus approached with his oldest son, a boy of 12 who was already showing signs of becoming a talented horseman. "Grandfather, we want to show you the new foal. She was born this morning while you were in town." Matthew let himself be dragged to the barn, Vivian following with amusement. The foal was indeed beautiful, all long legs and bright eyes, already trying to stand on wobbly limbs. Matthew ran his hands over the young horse with practiced expertise, checking for any issues, and found none. "She is perfect," he declared. "What are you going to name her?" His grandson thought for a moment. "Hope, because grandfather says that is what you and grandmother gave each other. Hope to keep going." Matthew felt his throat tighten with emotion. He looked at Vivian and saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes. This was their legacy. Not just the land or the horses or the thriving business, but the love and resilience they had modeled for their children and grandchildren. "Hope is a perfect name," Vivian said softly. As the sun set on Matthew's 60th birthday, the party continuing around them with laughter and music, he held Vivian's hand and thought about the journey they had traveled together, from grief and loneliness to love and family, from empty houses to a home full of life, from existing to truly living. The Wild West had been harsh to them both, taking away people they loved, testing their strength and resolve, but it had also given them each other, and from that connection had grown something beautiful and enduring. They had chosen to move forward when it would have been easier to stay stuck in sorrow. They had chosen love when love seemed impossible, and that choice, renewed every day for over 20 years, had made all the difference. "What are you thinking about?" Vivian asked, squeezing his hand. "That I am grateful," Matthew said. "For you, for our family, for every day we have had together, that I would not change anything, even the hard parts, because they led me here to this moment." "That is very philosophical for a cowboy," Vivian teased. "I married a smart woman. Some of it was bound to rub off eventually." She laughed and leaned against him, and they stood together watching their grandchildren play, their children talk and laugh with neighbors, their life continuing in all its chaotic glory. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and horses, familiar and comforting as a well-worn blanket. This was happiness, not the fairy tale kind, but the real kind built from choosing each other day after day, year after year, the kind that survived challenges and celebrated victories, the kind that honored the past while embracing the future. Matthew Rourke had lost his wife to fever, and in his darkest moments, he thought his capacity for joy had died with her. But Vivian Lawson had moved in next door with her blunt honesty and beautiful laugh, and she had taught him that the heart has room for more than one great love, that moving forward is not betrayal, but courage. That laughter in the face of sorrow is not disrespect, but defiance. Together, they had built a life that neither could have imagined in those early days of grief. A life full of love and purpose and the simple pleasure of growing old beside someone who truly knew you. As the stars emerged in the Nevada sky and the party continued around them, Matthew pulled Vivian close and pressed a kiss to her temple. "Thank you for teaching me to laugh again," he whispered. "Thank you for being worth laughing with," she whispered back. And in that moment, surrounded by the life they had created together, they were both exactly where they were meant to be.